Atlantic Ocean. February 1942. 300 miles east of Cape Hatteras. The water was black and freezing. U-boat U-108 ran at periscope depth, her commander, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Schultz, watching the horizon through the eyepiece with quiet satisfaction. Another silhouette. Another merchant vessel moving without escort, without zigzag, her running lights still burning as if the war hadn't crossed the Atlantic yet. He gave the order. The torpedo ran true. The explosion lit the February darkness orange. Schultz logged the kill, then surfaced to inspect the wreckage. Floating debris. A name stenciled on a life ring. SS Oakmar. American. 5,600 tons of war material gone. Back at headquarters in Lorya, Admiral Karl Donitz received the report with controlled elation. His arithmetic was elegant and ruthless. If his U-boats could sink tonnage faster than the Americans could build it, the war at sea was already won. Britain would starve. The Soviet Union would be cut off. The Reich would have time. The math, Donitz believed, was on Germany's side. He was catastrophically wrong. To understand what happened in America's shipyards, you have to understand what Donitz was trying to do and why, for a terrifying stretch of months, it nearly worked. The strategic concept was called Tonnage Krieg, the Tonnage War. It was deceptively simple. Britain imported roughly 47 million tons of goods annually before the war. Donitz calculated that if his U-boats could sink 700,000 gross tons of Allied shipping per month, consistently, the cumulative loss would overwhelm replacement capacity. Britain's war economy would buckle. Its population would face starvation. The island nation, dependent on its Atlantic lifeline for food, fuel, and weapons, would have no choice but to negotiate. The concept wasn't fantasy. In 1941, U-boats sank 4.3 million gross tons of Allied shipping. In 1942, they did even better, 7.8 million gross tons, representing over 1,600 individual vessels. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, the Germans sank more Allied tonnage than had been destroyed in the entire previous year. American coastal waters, poorly defended, badly lit, chaotically organized, became a killing ground so efficient that German submarine crews called it Die Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Admiral Ernest King, chief of naval operations in Washington, understood the crisis. So did Winston Churchill, who later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. In January 1942, Allied shipbuilding was producing roughly 650,000 gross tons of new merchant vessels per month. Donitz submarines were destroying nearly that much, and his fleet was growing. The math, in those early months, really did seem to favor Germany. What Donitz and the German Naval High Command, the Oberkommando der Marine, could not model in their calculations was something they had never encountered. American industrial capacity unleashed, organized, and pointed at a single problem with the full force of a mobilized democracy. They had seen American factories in newsreels. They had read intelligence reports about American steel output. They had, in some cases, visited the United States before the war. None of it prepared them for what was about to happen on the waterfront of Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon, and Baltimore, Maryland, and in dozens of other ports up and down both coasts. Nothing in German strategic thinking had a category for Henry Kaiser. Henry John Kaiser had never built a ship in his life before 1940. He had built roads. He had built dams, Boulder Dam, Bonneville, Grand Coulee. He was a construction contractor, a man who moved earth and poured concrete and delivered projects ahead of schedule through sheer organizational willpower. He wore suits, not overalls. He spoke in production targets and delivery dates. When the U.S. Maritime Commission approached him about building cargo vessels, the established shipbuilding industry was skeptical. Ships required specialized skills, seasoned welders, experienced naval architects. Kaiser had none of that tradition behind him. That turned out to be exactly the point. Traditional shipbuilding was a craft. Workers cut and shaped steel with hard-won expertise, fitting pieces together the way a watchmaker assembles a movement, slowly, precisely, with pride of craft. Building a cargo ship this way took, on average, well over a year. Sometimes closer to 2. The industry considered this normal. Kaiser considered it absurd. His insight was almost offensively simple. A ship is not a work of craft. It is a product, and products are manufactured. Rather than constructing vessels in place, piece by piece in the water, Kaiser's engineers broke each Liberty ship into prefabricated sections, hull segments, deck assemblies, engine components that could be built simultaneously in separate workshops and welded together on the slipway in a fraction of the time. Workers didn't need years of shipbuilding experience. They needed to know how to weld a single type of seam, or rivet a specific joint, or install one category of fitting. Thousands of workers, including women entering industrial work for the first time, could be trained to a productive standard in weeks. The Liberty ship itself was designed for this approach. Formally designated the EC-2C1, it was not elegant. British naval architects, who had helped develop the original design, called it a plain, ugly ship. It was slow, top speed of roughly 11 knots. Its lines were boxy. Its steam reciprocating engine was considered obsolete technology. None of that mattered. What mattered was that every Liberty ship was interchangeable with every other Liberty ship. Every part, every fitting, every valve and pipe and hatch was standardized. The supply chain could be organized around a single blueprint replicated thousands of times. By early 1942, Kaiser's Richmond, California shipyards were already confounding German intelligence estimates. But the revelation that would later stun German analysts came on November 8, 1942, when Kaiser's workers set out to demonstrate what the assembly line approach could achieve at full pressure. The keel of the SS Robert Peary was laid at 12:01 a.m. What followed was a continuous, orchestrated industrial assault, shifts rotating without pause, prefabricated sections swinging into place by crane, welders working in teams under floodlights through the night. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the Robert E. Peary was launched, a fully functional ocean-going cargo vessel of 14,000 deadweight tons, ready to carry war material across the Atlantic. This was, admittedly, a publicity exercise. Kaiser organized it partly as a morale demonstration, with press photographers and newsreel cameras documenting each stage. Average construction time at his yards never matched that record. But the average was damning enough. In 1941, building a Liberty ship took roughly 230 days. By 1943, Kaiser's yards had driven that figure down to 41 days. Some yards briefly achieved averages below that. German naval intelligence received reports of these figures. The reaction, according to post-war testimonies from Kriegsmarine officers, ranged from disbelief to something approaching dread. Captain Gunter Hessler, Donitz's son-in-law and operations officer on his staff, later acknowledged in his post-war analysis of the U-boat campaign that the German command had fundamentally miscalculated American production potential. The initial models assumed American shipbuilding would follow European patterns, gradual expansion, constrained by skilled labor shortages, limited by traditional methods. Those models were never updated fast enough to reflect what was actually happening. What was happening was this: 18 shipyards, operating around the clock, 7 days a week, staffed by workers who had never seen a ship before Kaiser hired them. By the end of 1942, Kaiser's Richmond yards alone were producing ships faster than any comparable facility on Earth. And Richmond was only part of the picture. Portland, Oregon, Wilmington, California, Vancouver, Washington, and across the continent, Baltimore, Brunswick, Georgia, Savannah, Houston, New Orleans, Los Angeles. The U-boat fleet was not fighting the Royal Navy or the U.S. Navy. It was fighting a continent that had decided to industrialize the ocean. Let the figures speak, because nothing else conveys the scale of what happened. At the start of 1942, the United States had 14 operational shipyards building cargo vessels. By the end of 1943, that number had grown to 18 major yards, operating a combined total of 172 individual building ways, each one capable of producing a ship simultaneously. In 1941, American shipyards launched approximately 1.17 million gross tons of new merchant shipping. In 1942, they launched 5.34 million gross tons. In 1943, That figure reached 12.38 million gross tons. By 1944, American yards alone, not counting British and Canadian production, were launching over 18 million gross tons of new shipping annually. Against this, set Donitz's best year. In 1942, U-boats sank approximately 7.8 million gross tons of Allied shipping, their most destructive performance of the war. In 1943, despite a growing fleet, they managed 3.2 million gross tons before the campaign began to collapse. By 1944, total U-boat sinkings fell below 1.4 million gross tons. The crossover point, the moment when American production permanently exceeded German destruction capacity, came in the second quarter of 1943. From that point forward, the total Allied merchant fleet was growing, not shrinking, every single month. Donitz's tonnage war had lost its mathematical foundation. The Liberty ship program alone produced 2,710 vessels by the war's end, for a combined total of approximately 38 million deadweight tons of capacity. The average cost per ship fell from $2 million in 1941 to $1.5 million by 1943 as production efficiencies accumulated. This at a time when a single German Type 7 U-boat cost approximately $2.5 million to construct and required a trained crew of roughly 50 men who took years to develop. Compare workforce figures. Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 employed approximately 100,000 workers at its peak, many of them women, many of them Black Americans who had migrated from the South for industrial war work, most of them with no prior shipbuilding experience. Germany's largest single shipyard, Blohm and Voss in Hamburg, employed around 20,000 workers, drawing on a pool of skilled labor that was already being drained by Wehrmacht conscription. Compare also the raw material context. American steel production in 1943 reached 80.6 million tons. German steel production that year was 34.6 million tons, and it was under sustained air attack. The United States was not merely building ships faster. It was doing so from a base of industrial resource that Germany could not approach, let alone match. The German naval staff had a word for what they were experiencing by mid-1943. Not defeat, not yet. The word was Materialschlacht, the battle of material. It was a word they had hoped to avoid. It was a word that, in German strategic culture, carried the memory of the First World War and what material exhaustion had done to the Kaiser's army. They were living it again. On water, this time. The psychological corrosion set in gradually, then all at once. For the U-boat crews, the first sign was not strategic, it was personal. In 1941 and early 1942, the average U-boat completed multiple patrols. Crews built identities around their boats, their commanders, the kill marks painted on conning towers. There was a culture of heroism around the submarine service, carefully cultivated by the Kriegsmarine and eagerly amplified by Goebbels' propaganda apparatus. Commanders like Gunther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke were celebrated as knights of the deep, their faces on magazine covers, their victories announced on state radio. By 1943, those men were dead or in captivity. More than that, the ships they had sunk were being replaced faster than the facts of their sinking could be processed. A U-boat crew might spend 3 weeks stalking a convoy, survive a depth charge attack, limp home to Loria with casualties and a damaged pressure hull, and learn on arrival that Allied shipbuilding had more than replaced every ton they had destroyed during the patrol. The effort, the danger, the deaths of comrades, arithmetically cancelled. Intercepted letters from U-boat crews, analyzed by British naval intelligence after the war, showed the shift in tone with painful clarity. Early letters home spoke of confidence, excitement, certainty of victory. Letters from 1943 speak of exhaustion, of absent friends, of a growing sense that the mathematics were wrong. One petty officer, writing home in August 1943, his name withheld in archival records, described watching a newly launched American transport move through Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, escorted by destroyers. He wrote, "They build them as fast as we can sink them. Perhaps faster. I try not to think about this." At the command level, the reckoning was more formal but no less devastating. Donitz, by mid-1943, had access to production figures through German intelligence and neutral sources. He understood what the numbers meant. In his memoirs, written after the war, he acknowledged that the Allied shipbuilding achievement exceeded all expectations and altered the fundamental strategic premise of the submarine campaign. What he could not write, and perhaps could not fully admit even to himself at the time, was that the premise had been wrong from the beginning. The calculation of tonnage Krieg had been built on a model of American industrial behavior derived from peacetime data and pre-war observation. It had not accounted for what a democratic industrial society could achieve when fully mobilized, incentivized, and freed from bureaucratic constraint. German prisoners of war who were shown photographs and newsreel footage of Kaiser's shipyards as part of Allied psychological operations reported reactions that interrogators found almost uniform. Disbelief first, then a kind of stunned silence. One prisoner, a corvette captain captured in 1944, told his American interrogators through an interpreter that he had assumed the newsreels were fabricated, like our newsreels, he added, without apparent irony. When presented with production manifests and independent verification, he reportedly sat for a long moment, then said quietly, "Then we never had a chance." He was not entirely right. Germany had chances, moments when different decisions, different timing, different technology might have altered specific battles. But on the question of industrial tonnage, on the fundamental arithmetic of the ocean war, he was more right than wrong. The collapse of the tonnage war had consequences that rippled through every theater of the conflict. The most immediate was logistical. From mid-1943 onward, the Allied merchant fleet grew month by month, and with it the capacity to move men, weapons, food, fuel, and raw materials across oceans in quantities that German planning had deemed impossible. The supply of the Soviet Union via the Persian Corridor and Arctic convoys, a pipeline that had seemed perpetually threatened, stabilized into something approaching reliability. Lend-Lease deliveries, which had totaled roughly $1.8 billion in 1941 to 42, expanded dramatically as shipping losses fell. By 1944, the United States was delivering over $10 billion in annual aid to its allies, much of it moving through the very Atlantic corridors that U-boats had tried to close. The Normandy invasion of June 1944, Operation Overlord, was, among other things, a logistical achievement of astonishing scale. Some 2 million troops, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies crossed the English Channel in the months following D-Day. That crossing was only possible because the Atlantic supply chain was intact, and the Atlantic supply chain was only intact because American shipyards had produced faster than U-boats could destroy. There is a direct causal line from Kaiser's Richmond yards to the beach at Omaha. For the Kriegsmarine, the strategic failure produced institutional paralysis. Donitz continued the submarine campaign because stopping it entirely would have meant acknowledging a fundamental strategic defeat that had implications for overall German morale. But the campaign had become, by 1944, strategically incoherent. U-boats were being lost at a rate that training pipelines could not replace, against a convoy system now defended by long-range aircraft, improved sonar, coordinated escort groups, and the decoded Enigma traffic that the Germans did not know the Allies were reading. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, around 28,000 were killed, a casualty rate of roughly 70%, among the highest of any branch of service on any side of the conflict. Hitler, who had never fully understood naval strategy and had famously clashed with naval commanders over surface ship deployments, grew increasingly disconnected from the reality of the maritime war. His public statements in 1943 and 1944 continued to present the U-boat campaign as an ongoing strategic pressure tool. His admirals knew better. The numbers told a different story, and the numbers, ultimately, were what the war was about. Churchill had said it early, the war would be won or lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. He was right. And the Battle of the Atlantic was won in the shipyards of Richmond, California, before many of those ships ever put to sea. There is a Liberty ship still afloat today. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, docked at Pier 45 in San Francisco, is one of 2 surviving examples of the 2,710 vessels built under the program. She carried her cargo across the Atlantic during the war. She participated in the Normandy invasion. She is 441 feet of welded steel and standardized fittings, built by workers who had never seen the ocean when they were hired. She is not beautiful. Her designers never intended her to be. She was designed to be built fast, to carry much, and to survive long enough to deliver her cargo. Those were the only specifications that mattered in 1942. Beauty was a consideration for peacetime. Walk her decks and you are walking the answer to Donitz's mathematics. Every bulkhead is a refutation. Every weld is a counter-argument. She is what happens when a democracy, slow to anger and slow to mobilize, finally decides to concentrate its full weight on a problem. The Liberty Ship program teaches something that military history sometimes obscures in its focus on commanders and battles and turning points. Wars are not won only by armies. They are won by the people behind the armies, the welders and the crane operators and the women who learned in 3 weeks how to do work that guild craftsmen had spent years mastering. They are won by the Henry Kaisers who looked at a ship and saw a product, and by the maritime commissioners who gave him the contract against the advice of every established expert in the field. Donitz was a brilliant tactician and a devoted naval officer. His tonnage Krieg concept was strategically coherent within the assumptions it was built on. Those assumptions were simply fatally wrong. They were wrong because they could not accommodate what the United States was actually capable of doing when it decided to do it. The ocean does not keep count. It does not remember the ships that went down or the men who froze in its water. But the arithmetic remembers. 2,710 ships. 38 million deadweight tons. The math, in the end, was always American.